Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016, and after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And now it's your turn to share your stories. Today, I have another incredible bereaved sibling with me. Elliot is with us today. Elliot, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. And really excited and looking forward to your story. You lost your sibling. You lost Dylan over 22 years ago. So you have quite a journey to share with us, Elliot. Elliot, take us back to 2003 when you lost Dylan. Tell us a little bit about your life, what that looked like, your relationship with Dylan.
Dylan was my best friend. He and I were pretty much inseparable. In 2003, I was 8 and he was 6. Our parents were really close. We were really close. The four of us traveled around our area a lot. We camped and fished and we did a whole bunch of things together as a family, the four of us. We had dinner together every night. My parents worked opposite schedules. My dad was a police officer and my mom was a teacher. So he worked the night shift and she worked during the day. So we all got together for dinner every night and the four of us were just really close. And my brother was my best friend. I was a weird kid. I have since recently been diagnosed as autistic and ADHD, but I didn't know that at the time, obviously. And I had a hard time making friends. I had a hard time connecting with people. And Dylan was always there. He was younger than me, yeah, but he stood up for me when people were bullying me on the playground. He was always around. He was my best friend, and we went through everything together. He was the only person that stuck by me at the time.
And you have that interesting relationship that this comes up a lot too, being the only surviving sibling. You're the only. And so that really changes a lot as well. And there's a unique relationship. I come from what's considered a big family these days. I'm the oldest of 4, Elliot, right? So it's interesting. And a lot of you guys listening can likely relate to Elliot with this. But when you lose your only sibling, that creates a lot of dynamic changes in the family. And I know we're going to get into that because that's a big part of your story. But take us back. And I love that Dylan was like your little advocate and like had your back. And I connect with that too, because even though I'm the oldest of 4, my brother was my sidekick. I have 2 surviving sisters, but my brother growing up, we were 3 years apart. He was younger than me, so I connect with you on that. And he was like my little sidekick. I was a total tomboy, which some people are like, you were a tomboy? I'm like, yes, I was. I like him and I were outside playing together all the time. So I deeply connect with you on that. And right. It's like your little sidekick. And I think what you brought up too, Elliot, is having certain like being ADHD and things like that. Like in 2003, like we didn't really talk about that kind of stuff like we do now. And so it's really, I'm sure it's nice that you're able to understand yourself now and understand more about yourself and like, oh, this is why I behaved this way. And this is why I acted this way. And this is why. But back then it was like, I just thought we didn't talk about autism or anything like that back then.
I got diagnosed. I called and told my dad, and I was shocked because I wasn't expecting that diagnosis. And I called my dad, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we knew. We just decided to deal with it at home."
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah,
interesting, Elliot. That's interesting because, God, I didn't realize we were going to have so much in common right off the bat. But that's so interesting because my brother was extremely ADHD. I, to this day, still know that he had bipolar. And my family, like this was all discovered when he was in his 20s. So when were you diagnosed?
I got my formal diagnosis 3.5 years ago.
So very recent. Wow.
hmm And growing up, like, we talked about how Dylan was ADHD. That was not a secret. That was something we all talked about. Like, I remember my parents giving us Mountain Dew to calm down, to go to sleep. And, like, that was just a normal thing, but it was always geared towards Dylan. We talked about the fact that he had ADHD. They never discussed what was going on with me other than I was classified as a gifted kid in school, and the school was talking about, like, moving me up a grade, but they ultimately didn't wanna do it because I didn't have the social skills, and so that was the only time that was ever really talked about, was in that regard. So it was really interesting having that realization just a few years ago of, yeah, we were talking about Dylan being ADHD, but they were doing the same things with me. Like, they'd give us both a small glass of Mountain Dew, that kind of thing. That's a silly example, but it's the easiest one that comes to mind. But they were doing the stuff with both of us. We just only ever talked about it with respect to him.
How interesting. And I
So interesting.
actually love your example of Mountain Dew because, oh my god, like, it's a stimulant. It's like
Hmm.
the ultimate caffeine that you give, right? And so
Absolutely.
how fascinating. And I'm sure as you look back over, like, the past since you were officially diagnosed, I'm sure you're just like over these past 3 years, you're looking back and going, "Ah, light bulb. Oh, that's what
Hmm.
was going on with me," right? Like, what an interesting journey. But what you said about your father was so interesting to me too, because I remember my mom and my own father behaving very similarly with my brother. It was like, "Oh, we're just gonna handle it at home." My brother had so many issues with focus and staying in school, and, like, he was super bright and super intelligent, but he was bipolar too, and so the regulating the emotions and all of that, and it was so obvious to me, and I was like, especially when I did my own therapy, so it was like, why were we but they had a very similar reaction when these things started to become obvious and, like, diagnosable. It was like, "Well, we just handled it at home."
Bit of a struggle with that of, like, realizing that there's all these coping tools and just like life management tools that I never really learned as a kid. But my parents were doing what they could in terms of making sure that both Dylan and I were always stimulated in one way or another. Like, we were both involved in sports constantly. And at school, we were doing regular school stuff, and then we'd come home and our parents would teach us all these other things. We were always learning, we were always moving, and, like, they did what they could, and again, in 2003, with the information that they had, it was looking back, I can see that they were trying so
Yeah.
hard to do what they could, and it's just interesting having the hindsight to be like, there's all these different things about my life that I could have been learning as I was growing up rather than having to try to learn them as an adult.
Yeah, and I think it's really amazing that you're able to have that empathy to be like, they were doing what they thought was right, right? And I think that's a beauty and a thing that comes I think it comes with loss, right? I think that we
Yes.
have a yeah, it's interesting. It's a sprinkled theme this season as I'm recording with all of you incredible siblings that have lost siblings. It's an empathy season for sure because we are able, I think it's easy to say, "Oh, this could have been better or this could have," but, like, when we go through a significant loss, especially like you, Elliot, at a young age, there's an empathy that is instilled in us, and it used to blow people's minds because people would be like, "Wait a second, you became more empathetic after a traumatic loss?" And I'm like, "Yes. While you can be angry and
Absolutely.
go through all these emotions, right? You can also become more empathetic." And I so feel that with you, and we're gonna get into all of that. But Elliot, take us back to this day with Dylan, where it was extremely unexpected how you lost Dylan. So take us back to that day of four-wheeling.
Yeah, so it was just a couple weeks after spring break. We had a wonderful spring break that we got to go spend with our Nana and Papa. It's my dad's parents. We went to Disneyland with them. They took the two of us to Disneyland for spring break. We got to hang out, and they lived in Nevada at the time. We got to hang out in Nevada in the warm weather. And we came back, and it was a couple weekends later. Our neighborhood at the time, we were all really close knit. It was a neighborhood of fairly similarly aged parents with fairly similarly aged kids. A lot of our neighbors had older siblings about my age and younger siblings about Dylan's age. So everyone kind of looked out for each other. All of us played in the street around the neighborhood. We rode bikes, and all of the adults around the neighborhood all looked out for all the other kids. And it was like there was this big sense of camaraderie around the neighborhood. But my parents in particular were friends with a couple of neighbors down the street. That particular day, we'd gone down to one of the neighbors' houses, and we were all just hanging out and playing, enjoying the spring weather. Neighbors that we were with, their daughter was right about a year younger than me, and she and I were playing outside, and their son was about a year younger than Dylan, so he was playing with Dylan, and we were just all enjoying the day. It's not like we
Totally.
grew up with a whole bunch of technology or anything. Megan and I were playing with Barbies on the sidewalk, and Dylan and the neighbor boy came over and they wanted to play with us. We didn't necessarily want our younger brothers crashing the very involved game that we'd been playing. And so it sounds mean now. At the time, we had done it on purpose to get them to go away, which feels so mean thinking about it. But we had told them that they could play with us if they played the girl Barbies, because we knew what we wanted the boy Barbies to do. And they obviously didn't want to do that, so they left. They said they were going to go ask our dads if they could go take a ride on the four-wheelers instead. And I remember feeling off about it. I remember something feeling just not quite right. And the boys had clearly gone to go talk to our dads, and there was another neighbor guy that was there with his son as well. His son was about the same age as the other two boys. And so all three dads got on the four-wheelers with all three boys, and they drove off. Now, I suppose I should probably clarify, the boys, none of them at 6 years old were driving on their own four-wheelers. They were like sitting in front of their dads, and everyone was wearing helmets, and it was all very safe.
Disclaimer, it was very safe.
Everyone was
Yeah.
safe. No 6-year-olds were driving four-wheelers on their own, I promise.
We hope you're enjoying this incredible episode of the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. We'll be back in just a minute after hearing from our incredible sponsor. If you've lost a sibling, trust me, I know exactly how you feel. I'm Maya. I'm the host of the Surviving Siblings podcast, but I'm also the founder of Surviving Siblings Support. I know that going through this experience is extremely difficult, whether you've lost a brother like me, a sister, or perhaps more than one sibling. Trust me, we know exactly how you feel. So that's why I started our Patreon account. You can click below to find out more about our Patreon. If you join our Patreon group, it'll give you just a little bit of extra support that you need along your journey as a bereaved sibling, or as we like to call it, a surviving sibling. We offer monthly support groups. We offer a free copy of our grief guide that is actually found on Amazon. It's called the Grief Guide for Surviving Siblings. We also offer direct messaging to our community and to me for extra support. And we have incredible events. We have workshops throughout the year that you'll get access to, and you'll also have access to our summit that happens annually. And so much more as you'll connect with a community of surviving siblings that understand the journey of losing a sibling. You can click below to join us today and also check out some additional VIP features that we offer. I hope to see you in the group, and until then, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.
But I remember feeling absolutely sick when I heard the four-wheelers leave. That is the first time in my life that I can remember just feeling unsettled about something. My stomach went cold, and I just was paralyzed with how awful I felt. And I didn't know how to explain this to the neighbor girl that I was playing with. And it's not something I'd ever experienced, so I didn't even have any idea where to begin. So I suggested to her that we go ask our moms if we could have popsicles. They were sitting up on the front porch. We went up, and while she was asking her mom if we could have popsicles, I asked my mom where the guys had gone, which was obvious because we'd heard them leave, but she said that they'd left on the four-wheelers, and that they'd be back. And that's the last thing I remember for a little while. And a couple hours later, which was obviously way too long, we were all inside. And the way the houses were set up, they were mostly the split level where you walk in the front door and you've got stairs going up and the stairs going down. And upstairs, going in upstairs, there was like the three windows that kind of stuck out a little bit. And I remember we were sitting in the living room and a cop car pulled up in front of the house. The lights weren't on, but a cop car pulled up in front of the house. I saw my dad get out of, he was sitting in the front seat, but my dad was a police officer at the time, and all of his friends were police officers. And so it made sense.
It wasn't too crazy yet for you to
It
process
wasn't too
because
crazy.
yeah. Mm.
It wasn't too crazy because, like, all of his friends were police officers, and I was used to it was a normal sight for me. And when he came in the house, I didn't see his face when he came in, but the adults had, and they started ushering the kids into the bedrooms. And I got into her bedroom before she got there. She was lagging behind. She was protesting at being ushered out of the room. And when she finally got into her room, she told me she thought she'd overheard my dad say that Dylan had died.
This was your friend
Yeah,
that you've been
the
playing
girl
with?
that
Yeah.
I, yep. So she was 7 at the time. And she told me that she thought she'd heard that. And I said, like, no way. Like, that's not possible. You must have heard them wrong. But I still felt just absolutely sick. Despite me protesting with her, I knew she wasn't wrong. And it sounds weird and, I don't know, maybe kooky to say that.
I think it's
I don't know.
intuition. It's intuition, and you were so young, right? And, like,
Mhm.
this is, like, your first big event where, like, you are being forced to, but also it's coming out as intuition, and, like, we don't ever forget the first time we have a bad feeling about something, or and for this to be that kind of big moment where that happened for you, Elliot, and it's this big,
Yeah.
I don't think it sounds weird or crazy or anything at all. I think as siblings, this is why we talk about these stories on this show and just we offer all this support because we have a connection, right? We have a connection. There's something really amazing that bonds us together as siblings. And that is in you, even at a young age, which is showing through your story and your recollection of it. And you knew something didn't feel right. And our brains, I feel like, often process a lot slower. Like your friend is telling you this, but and you're like, no way. But in your gut and in your intuition, heart, whatever you want to call it, you knew something was off the whole time.
Yeah. And he and I were really connected.
What happened next? So
That's
your friend is telling you this, and you're in this room, and your head is going, no. Your intuition is going, yeah, maybe, because this doesn't feel right. What happened next?
for me, that's the worst part of the day. What happened next? My parents left. They left the house, and the mom that was at the house that we were at, she told me to go down to my house and grab some PJs for the night and come back, and that I was going to stay there for the night. So I walked down to my house and I got PJs and came back and slept in the neighbor girl's room that night. Well, I didn't actually sleep. I didn't sleep at all. I was up all night. And then my parents eventually came back the next morning.
So you are just this young child, no answers. You have no confirmation at all about Dylan at this point.
Yeah.
So when your parents came back the next morning, did they sit you down? Did they speak to you, Elliot? What happened?
They did. I remember curling up in my dad's lap in their living room, and he told me what had happened. He just explained that there was an accident and that Dylan had passed and that he wasn't going to be coming home. And I'm not really sure I had a super good understanding of what death even really was at the time. I was 8 years old. We hadn't even lost a pet at that point.
Yeah.
We had a dog, but she was alive and well all the way up until I was in college. I'm not really sure I knew exactly what death meant at the time, but I did know that he wasn't coming home. The next couple weeks turned into a really hectic blur of family coming and funeral arrangements, and it was all very weird. Like when we were preparing for the funeral, I remember my mom taking me to the store to find something to wear for the funeral, and she specifically wanted me to pick out like a light colored dress, something that wasn't black.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I ended up in this like greenish bluish flower print dress. I don't know. It was odd to me at the time, and it's still odd to me now. I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of that one, but
Yeah, it's like those moments when you look back on those, like, what may seem like small details to other people, they're big for us, like, in our journey,
mhm.
right? And they're like, that is a representation, right? Like, what you're wearing is a representation. And it's interesting to me because those are very cheery and uplifting colors. That's not
Yeah.
a drab type of attire that one would wear at 8 years old, right? So, interesting, and you
Yes.
remember it so vividly 22
I
years
remember
later.
it
Yeah.
very vividly. Yes.
Mhm.
There's a handful of scattered things that I remember from that time planning the funeral. Like, I remember going with my aunt, my mom's sister, and her husband to go get him to get a suit, to pick out a suit for him, again, for the funeral, and listening to my aunt explain to the guy at the suit store, wherever we were, what had happened, and hearing for the first time in, like, adult language what had happened.
So, take us there, Elliot, because that is a moment. So, because they told you when you were at the neighbor's house, like, there was an accident, which is really appropriate in defense, right, of parents, like, that was really appropriate. But you now get another version, which is probably the more detailed version. So what did you hear? And if you don't mind sharing with us, what actually did happen? Because the last thing you saw was the boys leaving, and you knew they were going with the dads, and then you find out there was an accident and Dylan is gone. So there's a lot of stuff to piece together in the story. So, what did you hear? And then also, if you don't mind filling us in, so we have knowledge because so much could happen on a four wheeler. Like, my mind goes, oh my gosh. Yeah,
Yeah, so what I overheard, and they clearly thought that I couldn't hear them or, like,
of
wasn't paying
course.
attention or something, but she said that the four-wheeler had hit a rock and tipped over, and that the handlebars had snapped his neck.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I
What
overheard
what
that,
was
and I
going through
clearly
your
wasn't
mind?
supposed.
Right. Right.
I
So how did your 8-year-old self process that? Yeah.
really surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. That was a hard one for me to process. I was not expecting to have that detailed of information about what had happened. Thinking about that was really hard for me to wrap my head around, all the way up until the funeral, which was another wildly vivid and not great time. Like, we had a open casket funeral.
About that. Yeah.
I remember walking up to the casket next to my mom and seeing that his lips were blue. And I had no idea why. Like, I didn't understand biology and anatomy and all of that at the time. And so I vividly remember asking my mom why his lips were blue. And she explained it's because there's no blood in them anymore. Like, weird detail to remember. And the guy who was like officiating the funeral or whatever you call it, mispronounced our last name. That's the
Oh
other
my god.
vivid memory I have. Well, he was like a family friend and always mispronounced our last name, historically speaking. They had known him, like, our family had known him for a long time, and he just always pronounced our last name. And I just remember that very vividly, sitting there watching this man conduct my brother's funeral and mispronouncing our name and just being unreasonably upset about it.
But
Like,
little did your 8-year-old self know that's totally normal in grief, right?
yes.
Like, because you don't forget it, and those are the
Mhm.
things that we get super upset about. So what great insight, Elliot, that, like, even at 8, those similar things were upsetting to you as folks all the way up until we leave this earth, right, and go wherever we go. But it's interesting that even an 8-year-old would be like, "I can't believe you said my name wrong." That's so cute. It's
Mm.
cute. I think it's
Yeah.
cute.
It just felt like such an out of body experience. Again, I know now that's dissociation happening, but
Yeah.
at the time, I didn't understand why everything around me just felt so fuzzy, and I felt like I was seeing the world from outside my own body and everything. And to have just that kind of snap into my body moment of, like, this dude's saying our name wrong at my brother's funeral. What? It's funny to think about. Walking up to the casket,
Yeah.
specifically, and, like, seeing him laying there,
Yeah.
that was I think that was the moment when everything started to make sense.
It was like, he really is dead. Like, you really
Yeah,
felt it at that moment. Yeah, because everything prior to that, because you hadn't Elliot, you hadn't seen Dylan's body prior to that, right? There was not, so that's
no.
why it was like, and as a child, it's definitely not anything the same, but I was about 10, I think 11 when I saw, yeah, 11, maybe shy of 12 actually, somewhere around there, these ages. But it was the first
They
time
do
an
blend
open,
together.
they do. I saw an open casket, and it was of a baby, a neighbor baby that died in our neighborhood. And my mom took me to the funeral, and that is imprinted in my mind forever. I can't I, that was I was older than you, Elliot. So, and I knew this baby because I babysat for them. So it was a very wild experience. And I connect with what you're saying because it was like I really understood what death was at that point. Maybe not in the way that I would later in life, but I was like, oh, this is death. It was so intense seeing such a young body lifeless. And I was like, it was so imprinted on me. So I can't even imagine being 8 and seeing my brother. What a moment. I can understand why that was like a moment for you, and a moment, probably your, I would ask you this. Is this kind of like your moment where it was like, okay, this is real, and like, here we start this new life? Was that kind of when that kind of imprinted on you, or where did you go from that moment? Because that feels very real for an 8-year-old.
Yeah, it was that moment, and I would obviously, I was young and everything, and trauma looks a little different when you're young, but that moment was pretty traumatic for me, and I ended up having, like, flashbacks and nightmares and stuff for years remembering that moment, and there's nothing scary or dramatic or whatever about that, but something about it really hit me, and ended up having flashbacks and nightmares for years of just that one moment. And I was never at the place where the crash happened. I never saw the four-wheeler again. Like, I never saw any of those pieces, but somehow after that moment, my brain created an image of what I assumed it looked like what my brain assumed happened, filled in those pieces, like trying to make sense of how we got from them leaving the house to this. And so my brain just tried to fill in what happened in between. And still to this day, I have like this little video, I guess, in my head of the gap that my brain filled in of what happened.
I think a lot of people listening, you guys out there that listen to the show, will connect with this, because I connect with that, Elliot. Because I'm never going to know what took me from the last moment I saw my brother or spoke to him to the point where I saw him in the hospital after he was killed. So we do that. And I think that was quite advanced for you to do also at 8. And then also there is an imagination that happens with children, so it's a hybrid of that. But I think that's one of the reasons whenever I have a guest on that talks about losing a sibling as a child, you grow up quite quickly because of this experience and
Yes.
having to make sense of this, right? And so I wanted to point that out because at 30 years old, I was doing that. And those of you who have lost at all different ages, we've all done that. But to have to do that at 8, that's a lot. And you grow up
Yeah,
quite quickly, right? Yeah.
I really did. And it seems like it was that moment. I remember standing there and putting those pieces together of just like filling in the gap of this must be what happened. And everything just fell from there. And I did grow up really quickly after that, especially seeing how everything was hitting my parents.
Yeah.
It was so hard for them. Like, it was hard for me too, but somehow, I don't know how I managed to come to this conclusion, but somehow I came to the conclusion that I needed to take care of them. And so I tried to be as easygoing and manageable. I was a good kid. I followed the rules. I did everything I was supposed to do. I tried not to cause any problems for them. I grew up pretty quickly after that. It's funny,
Yeah.
I remember a few weeks after I had gone back to school finally, and one of the nights after I'd gone back to school, we were getting back into the routine of having dinner together every night, and I went to go get out the plates to set the table, which is one of the things that I did to get ready for dinner, and I grabbed 4 plates instead of 3, and I remember setting them on the table and just, like, breaking down crying. And then both of my parents were upset and crying, and, like, me realizing that I didn't wanna be the thing that made anything harder for them.
You felt like that was on you and it was just an honest thing that you were
Yeah.
doing because you had done that for so many years. And
Mhm.
yeah, and I think that's like Elliot, don't you think that's a really tough thing, especially losing a sibling as a child? I think this happens too, like when we lose someone in our sibling in our 20s and 30s, because our parents are still super involved in our lives, right? Obviously, in different ways, different capacities, as we both know. But when you're a child, though, like you don't want to do anything, like you just shared. You don't want to do anything to upset them. Like you just want to be like the perfect kid and just try to make up for the fact that your other sibling isn't there anymore. And that's so much pressure.
Yeah. After seeing how just broken they were at the time, like, I didn't wanna do anything to make that any worse than it already was.
Of course not.
And
Yeah.
I already had a lot of guilt. We talked about that a little bit before the show, that I had a lot of guilt already. I felt so horribly guilty. Even at the time that stuff was happening, when I felt that just ice-drenched cold feeling in my stomach, at the time, I thought that was me feeling guilty for being part of telling the boys to go away. And so I've just held that over to feeling guilty and responsible for trying not to make things worse than it already was for my parents.
So yeah, that feeling that you have just continued to manifest, like the
Mhm.
guilt, because yeah, you shared it so perfectly earlier in the episode about how you had that feeling, how you had that feeling. And yes, before we hit record, we started talking about the guilt. And this is something that comes up so much with you guys with surviving siblings. So we're definitely going to talk about this because this is something Elliot has experienced through your safe to say through your whole grief journey, right, Elliot? It's
Mhm.
like
Yeah,
prior to even losing Dylan, you were feeling that in that moment when you were really just being a kid. You were like, get away, bro. Like, this is Barbie time. You know what I mean? Like, you were just
yeah.
being a kid. But it's interesting how we are, like we talked about earlier, connected to our siblings. We feel a certain way. And you were so young. And so it's interesting how that has continued on for you. Kind of also talking about guilt, but also talking about your next few years. Tell us a little bit about because you were 8. So how did the rest of your like childhood and middle school, high school, like were now, some people will say they were an only child afterwards. And like, while I believe that's true when you lose your only sibling, like you're always going to have your sibling. So I'm like, you're always going to have a sibling. But
Yeah.
you were living life physically, like I like to say, as an only child. So, what did that look like for you? Obviously, very difficult, I'm sure, because of your parents. And so, lots of questions sprinkled in there, Elliot. But if you want to share that with us, and then how did your guilt, because it's stayed with you. So, share a little bit of that with us, and then we'll get into some of these other topics because it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, talking about the only sibling thing, I still to this day hate when I meet new people and one of their small talk questions is, "Oh, do you have any siblings?" or whatever. I still to this day hate getting that question. And it really depends on the person to how I'm going to answer. And I hate saying that I'm an only sibling or that I'm an only child. I hate saying that because it feels like writing him out of history, writing him out of existence. And I don't want to do that.
I
But
agree.
also, I don't owe that piece of my grief to random people that I meet. So it's always a weird and really challenging question that
Yeah.
is a normal question that people ask each other when you're getting to know somebody, but I absolutely dread meeting new people and getting that question.
Yeah.
The next few years after that were incredibly challenging. Really held on to a lot of that guilt. If I had just been a better sibling and let him play with us, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And with him not being around anymore, when we talked about him, when somebody passes, you talk about all the idealized things, how wonderful they were and everything. But Dylan genuinely was just such a good person, such a good kid, even for just 6 years old. 6 year old kids, especially 6 year old little boys in 2003, were agents of chaos. But Dylan really was not like that. He was just good. I remember being sick one time and him bringing me his blanket and stuffed animal to try to make me feel better. Like, he was that kind of kid. So now that he had passed, talking about what kind of person he was, it was even more amplified. And so when my parents and my family and we'd talk about him, they'd talk about how good of a little brother he was and all of that. And it always just made me feel sick because if I'd been a better sibling, if I'd been a sibling more like he had been, maybe we wouldn't be sitting there. So the guilt was really heavy for me, really up until just the last couple of years when I finally started dealing with it. But we were there for about a year after he passed in that town, and then my dad got an opportunity with his job that took us to a different state. Moving to a different state after having lost Dylan was really hard. Going to a whole new place, we couldn't go visit his grave. I couldn't go hang out with his friends because I had started doing that after everything mellowed out and went back to normal. I had started hanging out with some of his friends and we'd talk about him, stuff like that. But now I was in a place where nobody had known him, nobody had known any of us. And the place we were in, I did not fit in for reasons. So we lived there for 2 years, and I had no friends for 2 years. Like, my parents tried to throw a birthday party that first year we were there for me, and nobody came.
Wow.
It we did not fit in. We did not fit in there. And so I was alone for 2 years. By the second year we were there, I had managed to come by a couple of friends, which was good. But that first year was really awful.
It sounds brutal. And when you go through something tough again, as we talk about often on the show, like whatever your tough is that you're going through, it brings all of that grief and that loss back up to the surface. So it's just even more difficult. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. And it was while we were there that I started noticing my parents fighting. And they were fighting about anything and everything. And they tried to make it so that I couldn't hear. They'd try to go out in the garage or whatever. I still heard a
Of
lot of
course.
it, more than I ever should have. And that never got better from there. So after 2 years, we did move back to the town we'd been in before. So I was in sixth grade when we moved back. And my parents actually ended up getting divorced, or they separated about 8 months after we moved back. And they finalized their divorce however long later. But once they separated, everything that was bad just got amplified to even worse. And a lot of it all came back to us having lost Dylan. My mom blamed my dad. My dad blamed himself. He still does.
I was gonna ask you that, but I thought it would organically come up, and it did, Elliot, because
Yeah.
if you guys remember going back to Elliot's story, your dad was the one on the four-wheeler with
Mhm.
him, and so that
Yep.
can create a very difficult family dynamic when there is another family member involved in the accident. Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah.
I'm sure he blamed himself. I'm sure your mom blamed him, but at the end of the day, it was an honest accident. Yeah,
He still to this day blames himself. And I don't know that anything I can say will ever change that. And I hate that he blames himself
of course.
for an accident.
Of course it's hard.
And
What's
he got
interesting,
injured
Elliot.
too.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna ask you if
Yeah.
so he had an injury as well, and
Hmm.
but here's the thing that I've found in how in telling these stories and sharing these stories and just listening to them, is that we wanna take all of this on as the sibling that's lost a sibling, and we wanna be there for our parents, and you're talking about that in your story, even at 8 years old, it's like you wanted to just do but the reality is your parents, your dad and your mom, they have to, like, your mom has to forgive your father and realize that, and they have to come together, or they
Yep.
don't, right? And your father has to forgive himself because it was an accident. And what's so
Yep.
difficult is people like you, who are the surviving child, will often take this on as their responsibility. And I hear that in your story, and I think that's so difficult. But I think it's really great to hear that you're in a place now where you're like, I wish I could take that away for him or for mom. But reality is, that's for them. They have to go
Yeah.
on that journey, just like you're on your journey of losing someone so significant at a young age.
Yeah. And it did take me until just the last couple of years to actually sort out all of those things in
So
my
tell
head.
us what tell us what changed, Elliot, in the past couple years, because it's been 22 years for you. And that's we want to talk about 20 years because that's a huge milestone. But first, tell us what happened in the past few years that has helped you on your grief journey, because I noticed that when we connected and you wanted to come on the show, and I think that's going to be so helpful for people to hear that. So what's happened over the past couple years, because you've struggled with guilt,
Yeah.
you've struggled with wanting to be the perfect kid, you've wanted to, so you're in a different place now, which I think is cool.
I'm in a very different place now. Several things have changed. One of the things requires backing up just a little bit. I have not spoken to my biological mother since I was a teenager. Well, we've had a couple of text exchanges on occasion, but she and I really are not in contact. Things had gotten pretty bad between she and I, and she said some things that I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive. And some of the things that she had said to me, I really internalized, and I struggled really heavily with depression, anxiety. I'm not sure if I can say this on here, the self harm and suicidal ideation.
Of course you can. Yeah.
I struggled with that really heavily for a long time, and largely because of some of the things that she had said. And eventually, I went through college, and then I went to law school, and I got a law degree and moved to Alaska, which is 2,500 miles away from
Yeah.
where I grew up. So part of it was getting some space from some of those things. And part of it, I'd tried therapy several times over the years and never really found a therapist that I meshed with very well. I finally did coming up here and was able to deal with some of the trauma and stuff that was hanging on from my mother. So that was the first hurdle that I had to jump over, was dealing with those feelings. And then through working with my therapist, I actually ended up coming out as transgender. So I have changed a bit about how my life looks now, but I am more comfortable in my own skin and everything has settled a little bit for me. I Things are easier to process in my own head. I put it aside and put it in a little tiny box in the back of my head so that I could try to make my parents feel better. But once I wasn't living with my parents, once I wasn't even in the same state with my parents, I was able to kind of let go of that internalized obligation that I felt to them and let myself process those things in my own way. And it's made a huge difference. So it's weird to be sitting here 22 years after losing my brother and saying I'm just finally dealing with the grief and loss, but everybody's journey is a little different.
I think you said that perfectly, and thank you for being so raw and open and sharing your journey with us because one I want to go back for a second, but yes, everyone's on their own grief timeline. Elliot, you're absolutely right. Like 22 years, who cares? Here's the thing. I meet people sometimes they're like, I don't think I ever processed the loss of this person, insert this person or whoever it is. And it's been
Mhm.
decades for them. So I think we need to be proud of ourselves for being diligent and open to processing our grief instead of judging how long it may take or if it's a journey. So I think it's great what you've done. And I think it's one of the things that you were mentioning as you were sharing. So that's a lot. That's a lot that has happened in your life, like moving to Alaska, coming out, doing different therapies. That's a lot. But I am so happy for you that you didn't give up on therapy because a lot of us have these experiences with like we'll go in and we'll try to see a therapist. We're like, it's not a fit. And like we don't go back. And like I'm guilty. I did that in my past. But I talk about this pretty often about how therapy is like dating. Like if you find the
Oh,
right
yeah.
therapist the first time you go into the office, it's like you marry your high school sweetheart. Like that's like you got the jackpot. But like that doesn't really happen anymore. Like if that's you, that's cool. Like good for you. But most of us don't marry our high school sweetheart anymore. So I use that analogy or metaphor because it is like that and you have to find the person that fits for you and like what a testament to therapy for you like you changed your environment, you kept trying to look for the right therapist, and I do think finding the right person that really gets us and that we click with and can be life changing. And I don't mean to say that like they tell us what we want to hear, they tell us what we need to hear, and that's the
Oh,
right
yeah,
person.
she does not put up with she does not put up with my bullshit.
Yeah, but that's healthy, right? Like, and it's for me, that's when I knew I found the right therapist too, Elliot, when it was someone that was
Absolutely.
like, I'm a little tough. And that was also, that's kind of me. I like to be challenged too. So, like, I like someone who's going to challenge me a little bit, but also come from a loving perspective and be very
Yeah.
logical and analytical. So, it's about finding the right person. And I think it's really amazing that you were able to do that. And I think it's a great message to everyone listening. Like, be diligent, be your own advocate because there is somebody out there that's right for you on this journey, whether it's going to groups or going to therapy, or you just got to find where you fit. And I think you made a huge change in your life by moving to Alaska. Like, how cool is that? But it's a lot of different
Yeah.
changes.
I
Hmm.
met my now ex-husband in law school, and he's from Alaska, and so I followed him up here.
Hmm.
And initially, I was not interested in continuing to do therapy. I had tried to see a therapist during law school, and when I was telling her about my past attempts, she told me that I was lying about having attempted suicide. And so I was not particularly inclined to continue trying to do therapy after that, because that made me more suicidal. Crazy how that works.
Yeah.
When I got up here, I was married and I had a stepchild who looked at me as a parent, and I had a job that I cared about, and three wonderful dogs that have my entire heart, and a piece of me wanted to be able to be around for that. And having my stepchild especially was like I couldn't let them down. And so I was like, fine, I will try it again. and convinced myself that it was worth trying just one more time because I hadn't tried up here. And I did a whole bunch of research about the local therapists here and found somebody who was actually just a couple blocks away from where I was working at the time, that her bio just sounded like she and I would be the kind of people that if we ran into each other just out in the world, that we'd end up being friends. And so I went and saw her, and been fantastic. The rest is history. I've been seeing her for 3 years now,
That's
a little over
awesome.
3 years, and it seriously has made all the difference. I've known that I was trans since I was a kid, since before we lost Dylan. I've known since, like, kindergarten-ish, but I
That's a
had
long
convinced
time.
myself I was never gonna come out, partially because I knew it would be hard on my family, and when I did come out, it has been hard on my family. Like, one of the things
So,
that
Elliot, you were telling me before we hit record, so I want to make sure everyone else
yeah.
knows, you came out right before the 20-year anniversary of your brother's death, right?
Yes.
So it's like
Yeah.
that's a lot. Those are big milestones. That's a big milestone in your life. That's a big
Mhm.
milestone in your grief journey. And
Yeah.
that didn't pan out the way that I think all of us would like for it to pan out for you, right?
Yes. I came out to my parents. I'd come out to my friends several months before, but I came out to my parents a couple of months before the 20th anniversary of my brother's death. And my dad took it really hard. He felt like I was trying to replace my brother, which was really hard for me to hear.
Of course.
And he told me that he couldn't handle me being around for the 20th anniversary. So I was supposed to have gone home to spend that with my dad. And he told me that he just couldn't handle it and that I should not come home for that. I don't know if it was that or if it was just the year milestone, but the 20-year anniversary hit hard. I thought I'd hit all of those grief milestones by then. 1 year, 5 years, 10. 20 was something else. It's been a whole lifetime. Like a whole. I have a stepchild that is younger than 20. It's been. And my stepkid is 16 now, like 2 years from graduating high school. And seeing my stepkid growing up, especially, has been a weird time marker in terms of my grief. With them getting older and getting close to graduating high school and stuff, those are things that Dylan will never do.
Of course. The milestones.
Getting married was really hard because he wasn't there. And when I was a little kid, I envisioned my wedding as a kid and envisioned him standing up with me at my wedding.
Of course, me too. I totally get
Yeah,
it.
yeah. When you picture your wedding and when you're so close to your sibling like that, and you picture them being part of that with you. And my ex-husband was actually really great about it. We put up a picture of him, and he'd lost his stepbrother.
Oh,
So we put both of our pictures of both of our brothers up, and we lit a candle for each of them at the
I
beginning of
love
the
that.
ceremony
I love
because
that.
we'd both
Yeah.
lost brothers and wanted to take some time to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I love that. We get
Getting
questions a
married was
lot about that,
hard.
Elliot. We get questions a lot about that, like, how do I incorporate my sibling into my wedding or the births of my children or just different
Mhm.
milestones? So I think that's really beautiful that you did pictures with candles. Just wanted to call that out. I think that's awesome. But it is hard
Yeah,
because you envision them being there for all these
yeah,
milestones in your life and then they're not there.
yeah. I have a locket that has his picture that I actually, like, sewn into the inside of my dress.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So there's so
Yeah.
like, this is the thing, this is what I always tell people too, I'm like, it's so personal what you do too, right? Like, we can give you all
Mhm.
these great ideas and like what we did, but it's also personal, and like, that's what I love about sharing about this part of the grief journey too, is like, we can share our side of it, but it's also personal, so it might
Yeah.
spark some ideas for those of you listening, like what you wanna do for those milestones, but it is very
And I
challenging.
think a lot of the media and socially and stuff, we talk about those first 5 years so much, and those first 5 years, they are hard. Culturally, we don't really talk about what happens after that. It's part of why
No.
this podcast is so awesome. But you don't really talk about what happens after that in a social context. And so at the time, like when I was doing things like getting married and graduating from college, graduating law school, passing the bar, when I was going through those big milestones in my life, part of me felt ridiculous for like wishing that he was there being a part of this because it felt like culturally I should be over this by now. I shouldn't still be dealing with this 20 years later. But through working with my therapist, who is amazing, I've been able to come to terms with that it's okay that I'm still dealing with this 20 years later. He was a big part of my life, and trying to pretend like that didn't happen is only going to make things worse. And so I have let myself acknowledge that he was a piece of my life and he'll always be a piece of my life, and that I don't have to write him out of it. So I've let myself do things like that and not feel silly about it. I always keep a picture of him on my desk at work, and there's a picture of him on my bedside table. Always. They're just, they're always there. And when I have friends, people that are actually friends, I don't try to write him out when I talk about being a kid. If it's just somebody that I'm never going to see again, there's no point in talking about it, but I don't try to hide that anymore. There was a period in there when I was just when I was in college and stuff where I was essentially talking about my childhood as if it had always been just me, because it was easier that way rather than trying to dig up all of those feelings, and seeing the looks on people's faces has always been one of the hardest things. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. You
Yes.
get that look, and that look does not change no matter how long ago it's been.
Elliot, I will tell you, it does say the only thing that as I have gotten further in the grief journey, it will tell you a lot about the person though. It will tell you.
Yes.
So like as you get more comfortable, because what you're describing, Elliot, is something that I've gone through in my journey too. It's like in the beginning, I was like, I didn't really know how to answer the how many siblings you have and all of that. And then like it's evolved through time. And I share that very openly about how I answer it now.
Mhm.
But you said it really wonderfully too. I do the same kind of thing. Like I talk about this so publicly now, like most people know my story, but even so, even if they don't, like I choose. I edit the way I want to edit. If that energy feels good and it feels safe, then I'm going to be open about it. But even if like even being as public as I am about this story, if it doesn't feel like a safe energy or this is not going to be a connection, and it doesn't matter, work, personal, whatever, friendship, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
I get to choose. It's like those books
Yeah.
where we used to
It's a
choose
piece
our
of
own
you.
story. Yeah, it's a piece of me.
Yeah.
Exactly. I can choose what I want to share. And you've done that and evolved with that too. But yeah, but I've realized though, if I am feeling a little open that day and I just want to share, it will really tell you a lot about the other person, how they react, the
Yes.
face, the
It really
expression.
I'm
Either.
just not in the mood to deal with the face. Like, when I choose to share that with people, it's not because I want their pity or their sympathy or whatever. It's I'm sharing a piece of myself. It's just like talking about, I don't know, the time I cried in class in law school because my professor was terrible. It's sharing a piece of myself just like that. I don't share it to share or to get sympathy or pity. It's me sharing a piece of myself with them. And I've come to terms with being okay with that. I used to feel really guarded about it, and I guess maybe ashamed because I so desperately didn't want people's pity that I always worried when I finally did share that with people that they would feel like I was sharing it to get their pity. And I eventually had to just put that aside. I can't take on how they feel about it. But for
Absolutely.
me, it's a personal thing. It's a piece of my soul that is never going to go away.
Mhm.
Dylan will always be a part of my life. He'll always be my brother, always be the best friend I've ever had. And
Yeah.
I'm okay sharing that with people now, and it's up to them how they take it.
I love how you've had this realization that it's not your responsibility on how other people react to you sharing or what you'll share. It's your responsibility to love Dylan, carry Dylan within you, and make sure that you take care of yourself. And I think that's really wonderful because I think that's something that a lot of us bereaved siblings do is we're so concerned about everybody else that we just naturally take that on through life. And I think your story is a
Absolutely.
testament to that, Elliot. Elliot, let me ask you this before we kind of wrap and close out. Where are you comfortable? Because there's so much in your story. You've got 22 years of grief under your belt, which I know is like really tough, but there's a lot of people that will connect with this. They're going to connect with your story about losing a brother suddenly to an accident as a child. They're going to connect with your story about coming out as trans. They're going to connect with your story about having complicated relationships with your family. Where can people connect with you? Where are you comfortable? Social, email, what's best for you, Elliot?
Email is totally fine. You
Okay.
have my email address. Email is totally fine. And think people can send messages on like TikTok, right?
They can. What's your
I'm on
TikTok?
it's at Mouseling18. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll put your email and your TikTok handle in the show notes so folks can reach out to
Yeah.
you because again, you have so many 22 years into this, so many aspects of your sibling loss journey and just your personal journey that I think many of our listeners will connect with. So, Elliot, any
Yeah.
last pieces of advice that you want to give in your episode? Again, you've been on this journey longer than me, so I appreciate you sharing where you've been. And I'm just so happy for you that you found this incredible therapist. And it sounds like you've had this like amazing renewal of life over these past 3 years. So, any last pieces of wisdom you want to give our incredible siblings that listen?
Biggest thing I've learned over 22 years is our society tries to tell us that time heals all things. And that gives us the impression that over time, you'll stop feeling these things. I have learned that grief is more like a tennis ball in a jar. Your tennis ball is your grief, and your jar is your ability to handle it. And when you first start out, those first few years, man, maybe you can't even force that ball into the jar. But then, as time goes on, as you learn things, as you process, as you hit those milestones, your jar gets a little bigger. Your ball is never going to turn into a golf ball or a ping pong ball. It's never going to change. It's still going to be a tennis ball. But your ability to handle it and your ability to like recognize it and not have it completely ruin your day, that changes.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And you are using a metaphor that I really love. And then you like took it and made it even more your own. And I love that because I think I love a visual, Elliot. So I agree because a lot of people will say it doesn't get easier or it does get easier, but like the way that you're conveying it, it's not that it gets easier or it doesn't get easier. It gets easier because of your ability. I love that. Elliot, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.